Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be invited here. I'm quite happy to make the trip and talk to you today a little bit about my own experiences and perspective on Korean cinema. I've approached this, I think, less as an academic and more as someone who's been living in Korea for the past, 10, 12 years, and someone who has, if not experienced it directly, then at least seen it from very close distance. I think today's topic, I'd like to focus on producers, which doesn't sound like a very interesting topic. I mean, to me, it's quite interesting, but I suspect that for most people, it's really not that interesting at all. But I hope to kind of give you a different look at how Korean cinema has developed over the past 10 or 15 years. For myself, living in Korea, I've gotten to know some producers on a personal level. And so I think normally when we hear the word producer, we have this idea of someone who's kind of in an antagonistic relationship with the director. And the director is trying to realize a creative vision, and the producer is kind of setting limits and sometimes standing in the way. And although that does sometimes happen, I'd like to kind of try to broaden our perspective a little bit on this process of filmmaking and the contributions of producers over the last 10 or 15 years. My title comes from it's a quote from The Wizard of Oz, my rather long title. Producers have been, in a sense, working behind the curtain. Ordinary audiences aren't really aware of the work they do. And in overviews of how Korean cinema has developed, usually they're not really mentioned or focused on as well. And so I'd like to include them in our talk today. Okay, I'd like to begin with sort of an overview of sort of the accepted narrative of what's happened to Korean cinema over the past 20 or 30 years. Some of you might be very familiar with this, others perhaps not. But I think that this is more or less what people accept as, the background to Korean cinema's recent resurgence. Although Korean cinema was quite successful in many ways in the 1960s, the 1970s and 1980s were a very difficult period. Strict censorship on the part of the military government did a lot to really limit filmmakers and what they could do. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about how it was not limited to censorship. It went actually much beyond that. But most people focus on the issue of censorship. In the 1980s and 1990s, democracy took root and matured. Filmmakers found themselves free to explore new topics. There was you might call it a film movement or a mini film movement, the Korean New Wave, where a number of Korean directors were able to explore topics and social issues that had been more or less off limits before. And so this was one key development around the late 80s and early 90s. By the late 1990s, there was a younger generation of directors who appeared. Names that we might be more familiar with these days, like Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon-ho, Kim Ji-yoon, Hong Sang-soo, Kim Ki-duk. And for the most part, they created very diverse films, but for the most part, you can say they turned a bit away from realist cinema. And many of the new films were more focused on genre. They were either genre films or they were influenced by genre films. They were targeted at younger audiences, and they ended up becoming quite popular. When I first went to Korea in 1997, I was teaching and I would ask my students, what do you think of Korean movies? And all of them would say, Korean movies are terrible. I don't like Korean movies. But very soon after that time, films began to appear that young people were excited about. And so within a space of just a few years, the whole image of the film industry began to change. 1999 and 2000 were years when some very big Korean films, Shiri, JSA, these Korean blockbusters were first released. They were very popular with viewers, and I think that they also served to give a lot of confidence to the Korean film industry as a whole. Before this, people perhaps felt that they didn't have the capability of making these large-scale works that could connect with mainstream audiences. After these films were released, they felt much more confidence, and they started trying bigger and bigger films. At the same time, a lot of money began to flow into the film industry from various sources. I think that throughout this period, there was a commercialization of Korean cinema in general. To a certain extent, there was a degree of diversity that was maintained, however, and partly this was due to support from the government. The government did provide a lot of money to filmmakers, and they supported low-budget independent films to a certain extent. At the same time, I think we should give a little bit of credit to the Korean audience as well for being very unpredictable. I think that there have been films over the years. I don't know, you may be familiar with movies like The Way Home, a very low-budget drama that became an unexpected hit. There's a movie about women's handball recently that was expected to be very small, Forever the Moment, that ended up becoming very successful. And even a documentary about a farmer and his cow, which sold 3 million tickets. And so the makers of, the Korean producers have not been able to kind of rely on established models for making successful films. They've had to keep trying new things because the audience has been fairly unpredictable. Soon throughout the 2000s, international film festivals began to take notice of Korean cinema. Various directors began to win awards at overseas festivals. And so internationally, Korean cinema became better known. You're probably familiar with the Korean wave. The Korean films began to become more popular, and especially other parts of Asia, but to a certain extent around the world. And in recent years, the mood in the film industry has been much darker. There's a sense that the industry fell into somewhat of a crisis around 2007. And although people aren't quite as gloomy now as they were in 2007, there's still a sense that the industry has receded somewhat, and that it's going through a difficult time period. Economically, that's certainly true, and some people would argue in a creative sense as well. So I think my idea is this is the kind of the standard narrative of what's happened in the past 20, 30 years of Korean cinema. But this doesn't really include producers, and so I'd like to not revise this this narrative, but to kind of update it with this extra perspective. And I should begin by defining exactly what I mean by producer. We use the word producer a lot. It can be confusing in English, and it becomes more confusing by the fact that the Korean system is slightly different from the Hollywood system. In Hollywood, there are several, usually in a film, there'll be many people who are given a producer credit of one kind or another. Generally, the executive producer is someone who handles financial aspects of the film. Their job description may not list any creative involvement in the film, but of course, if you control the money, you have a certain degree of power, and sometimes people do insist on changes to a film. But originally, executive producers are meant to be in charge of the financial aspects. The producer, when I say producer today, I'll be focusing on this individual. The line producer tends to be the person who's in charge of going to the set and planning everything out for how the film will be physically shot. Not so much in pre-production or post-production, but really focused on when the film is being shot with cameras. The production manager, if the line producer kind of makes all the planning, the production manager really executes everything. The line producer and the production manager work together, but they're focused mostly on the set. I'll talk more about the producer in a second, but the Korean system, I mean, in one sense, you can simply draw lines between these titles. So executive producer would be 제작주자, which means like, producer, investor, literally, but someone involved with the money. The word producer is usually translated as 제작자. One of the confusing issues is that the line producer, or the in Korean producer, this word is not really the same as a producer in English. It's more of a line producer, or sometimes translated as a co-producer. This is someone who's focused more on what's going on as they're shooting the film. And then the 제작실장 is like a production manager. But this is somewhat skewed. The Korean titles are slightly above the Hollywood titles. And I'm doing this because actually there is a slightly different focus. The 제작자 takes on more of the tasks of an executive producer than in the Hollywood system. And so in the Korean system, it's slightly in between the roles. And so there's a lot of confusion when we talk about producers, especially when we compare the two systems between Hollywood and Korea. Okay, and before I talk more about the exact role of the producer and the very diverse roles, I would like to show you a small clip from a Hollywood film, which shows us a producer in action, working together with the director. I think that this might give you a better sense of it than as 10 minutes of explanation. And so we're going to watch a short, maybe perhaps about 5 minutes from the movie The Bad and the Beautiful, which is a 1952 Hollywood film. Kirk Douglas stars as a producer. He's working together with a director in the scene, and they're coming up with a new project for them to work on. So can we start by watching a bit of this clip? Okay, can we skip ahead one chapter? I think that, can we skip to the next chapter? One more chapter. Try one more. I think I may have written down the wrong chapter number.
Our toughest problem was a leading man.
Okay, I'm sorry. Back one more, and then we'll be all set.
So
Yeah.
I directed tests, a dozen tests. Our toughest problem was a leading man on a Harry Pebble. Our toughest problem was...
Okay, it's one forward from here.
Our toughest problem was a leading man. On a Harry Pebble budget, a top star was out of the question. So I directed tests, a dozen tests. Action.
You are correct. And I find you just as you promised. Now we're alone in the great house.
Yeah, I'm
Silent, proud.
not sure what. Try going back one more, and if that doesn't work, then we'll skip ahead. Back.
Switch over to the next one.
Yeah, and so back to, yeah.
The next morning,
Okay.
Jonathan received the news of our next assignment. See, Harry? Well, what's our next picture? Get a good grip on yourself. You ready? Our next picture will be the son of the Catman. That's
Three studios tried to lick it and couldn't.
Well, I can. There's my outline, scene for scene.
You know what Harry Pebble will say.
Look, I've told you 100 times, genius boy, I don't want to win awards. I want to make pictures that end with a kiss and black ink on the books. Jonathan, this is my baby. I found it and I left it. I've been nursing it along till I was sure that we could handle it. Well, now I'm sure. Remember what you said last night? Well, we've practiced long enough. It's time we made one for real. Of course, it should be made on $1 million budget, and it cries to be shot on location down in Veracruz. But you producing and me directing, we can make it on a Harry Pebble budget and still do it right.
For a guy who's tongue-tied when he tries to sell himself,
I could always talk to you.
you really want to do this one, don't you, Frank?
I want to direct it so much I can taste it.
All right, let's do it.
I told you 100 times I don't want to win awards. Give me pictures that end with a kiss and black ink on the books.
Take this picture, Harry, or I'll quit. This is my baby. I found it and I licked it. I want to produce it so much I can taste it. I'm handing it to you, Harry Pebble, father of the son of the Catman. Do I produce the Faraway Mountain or don't I?
All right, genius boy. You've got it coming to you. Make it and hang yourself.
If you feel that way about it, why don't you fire me and get it over with?
Oh, I know the talk around the studio. They say that I need you. That you do all the work and I get all the credit. You think I don't know anything? Well, I know one thing. Every studio in town turned this stinker down. Go ahead, make it. It'll lay such a bomb that you'll never get another job in this industry. Will I let you produce it? You're on suspension if you don't. I had thought my faraway mountain outline was perfect. After 3 weeks with Jonathan, it was twice as good. We worked day and night. Kay kept the coffee hot and handy. And as Jonathan shaped our material, I saw the birth of what Hollywood later came to call the Shield's touch. Jonathan's magic. Our toughest problem was a leading man. On a Harry Pebble budget, a top star was out of the question. So I directed tests. A dozen tests. Action.
So you are Therese. And I find you just as your brother told me I would, alone in the great house. Silent, proud, and beautiful. What is it? Are you afraid of me? I don't wear a stiff suit and tight collar.
Switch over to the next one. Action.
Okay, why don't we stop here? We'll watch up to this point.
You are Teresa. And I find you just as your brother told me. Alone in the great house. Proud, silent, and beautiful. Girl. Duvet.
Yeah, there's a right after this, after they finally cast the leading man, they're successful in casting a very prominent actor in the industry, and at that point, the producer, he kind of pulls a trick on his director. He ends up contracting a much more famous, established director. They go on to make the film, and it wins an Academy Award, and so we see in this clip kind of an idealized vision of the producer as someone who helps to develop the original idea for a story with the director, who goes over the screenplay, suggests changes, helps in the casting, and then goes together throughout the whole process of making the film. And then we also see kind of the negative side of a producer, in the sense that he does kind of personally betray his friend in order to make a better picture. But let's examine the issue of what a producer does. I mean, definitions of this are often vague, and I think because it's very different from picture to picture. I mean, the roles are very diverse. Some producers are very hands-on. Other producers tend to just let the director take more responsibility for the film. There's this quote from Brian Grazer, the person who must remember what the central vision and goal of the movie is and try to be fiscally and creatively responsible for that. I think that there are a number of skills that a producer needs. A producer needs to be able to read a screenplay and kind of visualize the final product and to judge whether it will be an effective movie. That's very difficult to do if you're just reading a screenplay. There's a Korean producer named Lee Yoo-jin, and I mean, she told me that the most important skill for producers is to be able to identify a person's strengths and weaknesses and to use that when assembling all the people that you need in order to make a film. And I think that some things I want to focus on here, influential producers who own their own production company, and the more successful producers, like in the Korean film industry, for example, they really create the system in which the director works. And I think that the system really matters. I mean, perhaps this isn't the best example, but if we think of Pixar, Pixar has a reputation of producing very high quality work. And if you look at their recent work, they keep working with new directors. Traditionally, if a film comes out very well, we credit the director. And so if you look at Pixar, you can either conclude that they're very good at finding talented directors with every movie, or that they've created a system where the quality of the film, a certain base level of quality of the film is guaranteed. And Pixar's making a very specialized kind of film, but I think that really talented producers are able to create this system that really helps directors to reach their potential. The other sort of thing I want to focus on is that I think that the producer does ideally fill a role similar to that of a book editor for an author. I mean, recently I read Stephen King's book on writing, and he makes a point to say in the book, the editor is always right. He says, to write is human, to edit is divine. And, I mean, he knows a lot about writing, successful commercial books, and no one would blame him if he were to turn to his editor and say, look, I'm the genius, I'm going to write it this way and you should just publish it. And he makes a point of saying the opposite thing. And the reason he does that is because you really need an outside perspective on your work sometimes. Creators of art become very personally involved in it. And ideally, you need somebody to give a more outside perspective. And in the film industry, the producer is the person who should play this role. Really, nobody else is going to do it. And so the producer-director relationship is a very important one in terms of filmmaking. Now I'd like to turn to the situation in Korea. And I'll start with kind of a more historical perspective on this. Korean producers in the 1970s and 1980s. I mentioned before that censorship was very strict in this time period. And so it was very difficult for directors to make interesting films. But as I said, it went much beyond censorship. And the government really determined the whole structure of the film industry. And they did this, I think, to keep control over what kind of movies were being made and control over the film industry in general. The government, I think, had a very high opinion of film's potential as an ideological tool. And so they wanted to have a say in what kind of films were being made. And if you look at the film policy of the time, I mean, the way they did that, the way you control the film industry, one thing you do is that rather than having 200 small production companies to look over, it's much easier to keep control if you have only 5 very large production companies. And the film policy at the time, you were only allowed to produce films as a production company if you received a license from the government. And so the government would choose companies, essentially, who had permission to make films. And their requirements were very strict. They required that you produce many films per year, that you had, directors under contract, that you owned, shooting sound stages where you could shoot films. And so throughout beginning in the 60s and leading through the 70s and 80s, there were just a small number of film companies that were making films. There was also a system that it kind of tied together imported foreign films, mostly Hollywood films, and the production of Korean films. Importing Hollywood films at that time was strictly controlled. It was similar to, I guess, the situation in China these days, although it was more authoritarian because they would only allow this small group of film companies, these approved group of film companies, to import films as well. And for example, if they wanted to import a Hollywood film, they had to produce 3 Korean films. That was one option. If they won an award at a foreign film festival, they would give them permission to a foreign film. In the late 70s, especially, the government would approve certain novels or certain subjects. And they'd say, if you make a film about these approved subjects, then we'll give you permission to import a foreign film. And because there were just a few number of Hollywood films, and occasionally Hong Kong films imported per year, they made a lot of money. And so companies were anxious to do what the government requested in order to get permission to import films and then to make money. Korean films, on the other hand, mostly they were just produced as a way to get permission to import a Hollywood film. And so if you need to produce 3 Korean films to import a Hollywood film, then you don't spend a lot of time developing the screenplay. You don't spend a lot of money on the budget. You just want to produce it as quickly as possible. And generally, they call these quota quickies. Generally, this is what was happening in the 70s and the 80s. And producers generally didn't expect Korean films to make money at the box office. Another thing I'll mention, I'll go back to the slide before. The system at that time, this wasn't dictated by the government, but I think it was kind of a result of the fact that they were producing films very quickly. There really was no producer here. There was the director, an executive producer who took charge of the budget, and then the line producer that would look after or handle issues on the set. I think this is one reason why we have this name confusion, because there was no producer at the time. The line producer was called the producer. And the 제작자 was the person in charge of money. But there was no one fulfilling the role of like Kirk Douglas in that clip we just saw. Someone working together with the director to develop a film. And the system was discontinued with an important reform in 1984. We don't really need to go into this in detail, but basically the system was taken off the books. And so there was no longer a licensing system for production companies. After 1984, you just had to fill out a couple forms, pay a fee, and you could open a production company. And so the number of production companies jumped in the years after that. Independent films were illegal until 1984 because you didn't have permission from the government. After 1984, if you didn't want to go through the process of setting up your own production company, you were allowed to make 1 independent film per year. And then this link between importing films and producing domestic films was cut. And so you could import a film. Imports were open up, basically. This is all against the backdrop of Korea opening up to the Hollywood market as well. Like Hollywood films were kind of given free rein to Hollywood film companies were setting up branch offices in Korea. But essentially, this harmful policy that had been in effect for 2 decades, it was discontinued after 1984. And one of the questions that has kind of inspired me to look deeper into this topic, I think that when you have these very harmful, oppressive policies and a system that doesn't really allow you to, it becomes impossible to have a healthy film industry under this system. When you take the system away, how long does it take for a healthy system to emerge? and what is the process of doing this. In the end, I think that there were many different people who were involved in creating this new healthy system for filmmaking. Some people involved in government agencies, some people involved in the investment side, but producers played a big role in this as well. There's something called planned films, which emerged in the early 1990s. It was introduced by a producer named Shin Jae, who is one of the most important producers in this era of Korean cinema. He was someone who was involved in marketing at this Piccadilly Theatre in Seoul, and as part of his job, he'd meet with a lot of moviegoers, and he'd ask them about what kind of movies they liked, and he came to understand the audience much better than most people working in the film industry did at that time. The system previously, I think, had been really geared towards the government's needs. There may have been films produced in the 80s that the director was hoping to reach a mainstream audience, but the system was targeted at the government's needs. And planned films is basically kind of changing the system to focus more on the audience. In this case, it means kind of choosing your target audience in advance, using market research. For example, they produced this film, Marriage Story, which is about a young couple who they get married, they're very happy, then the wife gets promoted at work and her career starts to take off, and the man's career stagnates. And this translates into troubles at home. And in order to make this film, they interviewed just hundreds of young couples and hearing about all their different experiences. And then the idea was that if you do all of this research, if you talk to all of these people, that you can produce a script that's more, it's much closer to actual experiences, and people will connect to it better. Throughout this, if you look in the credits for these films from the 90s, there's someone called a 계획자, or someone in charge of planning. Shin Jae says that at the time when he introduced these kind of films, he wasn't using Hollywood as a model, or he wasn't modeling this after any foreign film industry. But essentially, the 계획자 is the producer, and this was when a person with this kind of role first started really working regularly in the film industry. These days, people don't use the word 계획자. People don't talk about planning. But basically, this was the introduction of the producer into Korean cinema. And I'd like to introduce you just to a few figures who have become very influential in the Korean film industry. Seung Jae is the first one. He founded a small film company in 1995. It ended up growing bigger. He founded Sidus in 2000, and then merged with another production company to make an even bigger company in 2005. If you look at the films he's produced, it's a very impressive list. And I've highlighted some of the ones that are perhaps more famous internationally. But he's produced 57 films since the mid-90s. They include movies like Memories of Murder, Tatsa, which was a big hit a number of years ago. I'll skip to the next page. Musa, Christmas in August. If you think about Korean cinema, and a lot of the popular films or the critically acclaimed films of the past 10 years, if you take his films out of Korean cinema, you have a much different film industry. There's another producer, Shin Jae Myung, and she co-founded this company, Myung Films, in 1995. She works together with her husband, Iun. And in 2004, they merged with Kang Jae-gyu Films to form a bigger company. She too has been involved in some very, very big films. Joint Security Area was probably her biggest hit. Movies like The Quiet Family, Kim Ki-duk's The Isle. A lot of people point to this period because within the space of a year, Happy End screened at the Cannes Film Festival in one of the smaller sections. The Isle screened in competition at the Venice Film Festival. And then JSA screened in competition at Berlin. And so she had films in all three of the major film festivals within the space of a year. Here's another producer, Oh Jung-won, who she founded this company in 1999. And she's produced films like A Tale of Two Sisters, The Foul King, Untold Scandal. I mean, a while ago I realized that as I was following films and many films appear and they turn out to be not very good, even if you were looking forward to them, and other films come out and you're impressed with the quality of the film. I realized that many of these films seem to keep coming out of the same producers, out of the same production companies. I think this is an example where I think that these producers were successful in creating a system that really allowed directors to reach their potential. Myung Films, Shin Jae Myung, who I just mentioned before, one of the important things they did was to they're planning for this big budget film called Joint Security Area, and they needed a director. And I mean, the director they chose, Park Chan-wook, was very unknown at the time. He had made 2 previous films that had flopped. And not many people really believed that this director would ever amount to anything. And by having the courage to give him this film, they really kind of launched his career, I think. And without Myung Films, we may have no Old Boy or these other films from now. And so I think these producers, they've been successful in creating their own system. They've been kind of pushing for the development of production standards. I visited the office of Myung Films back in the early 2000s, and somebody who was working there kind of showed me this book, and he was very proud of the book, and he said, Myung Films is the only company that does this. Before we shoot a film, we produce this book, and we include all the information you could possibly want about what would be needed in shooting this film. And so in very fine detail, they listed all of their plans, and they had a storyboard where they sketched out all the different scenes and what they would look like. And they were the only company doing this at the time. And so this was one thing that they personally felt quite proud of. At the same time, Myung Films had a reputation for being kind of hard on their directors. There were a couple cases, for example, in Kim Ki-dak's The Isle, where the original film was much longer than the final film. And there was sort of a confrontation, you'd say, between the director and the producer over how long the film would be. The director wanted it to be longer. Ultimately, the producer won. Myung Films was, and Shin Jae Myung, she had a lot of power at the time, and she could, really dictate changes to the film. And so, because we can't see, the director's version of this, it's hard to compare and to say who was correct in this instance. But there are some other examples. Shin Chul, the director who I mentioned before, was the producer of My Sassy Girl. And My Sassy Girl, you actually can compare the 2 different versions, because the director's cut was released on DVD. It's about 20 minutes longer. The original version, was released in theaters at the time. And I mean, personally, I find the producer's cut to be the far superior film. It's shorter, it's much tighter. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the film was so successful. But of course, the director didn't like having a producer above him, forcing these cuts. And later in his career, he would go on to work, more or less independently, without such an established producer. But I would argue that his films, his career has not really, he's never produced a film at the same, with the same commercial quality as My Sassy Girl. Yeah, and then many directors made their debut with the help of an established producer. I think that, by working with an established producer, it's perhaps easier to find money to make your film. And so it's a help in that sense. But I think that creatively also, producers may have had a big influence on these directors in the early part of their career. I do have a friend who graduated from film school and who was working with Myung Films for a while on developing his script. It was never made into a film, but he said that they were very hands-on. They would, he would rewrite the script many times, and they would meet with him and have long discussions about the strengths and weaknesses of what he wrote and how he should change it. And so the producer is playing a very important role in developing the screenplay as well. The year 2006 is kind of it's kind of a watershed year in a lot of different respects. This was the year when Korean cinema kind of hit its peak commercially. They were more successful than ever before. 2007 was the year when things kind of fell into crisis. The other thing that you could say happened in 2006 was that it was the last year that producers really held a certain degree of the same degree of power and influence that they once held. There's a list published by film magazine Cine 21 where they list the 50 most powerful people in the film industry. And in that year, Seung Jae was number 1 for the first time. Shin Jae Myung was number 7. Oh Jung-won number 16. Since then, there's been kind of this really a steep drop in their influence. And there have been a couple different reasons for that. Partly this had to do with business decisions made by the producers themselves. I think that the skills that you need to produce a film are not the same as the skills you need to run a company. And surviving as an independent production company is difficult. And in retrospect, some of the decisions they made were harmful. But also there was kind of this shifting balance of power in the film industry that went against them. And I think that that's been another very important development in the past few years. One of the things that happened, I'll go through this somewhat quickly, but a lot of entertainment companies kind of fell into the trap of listing themselves on the stock market. If you're producing films, the most difficult part is always finding money for films. And so many producers were, their biggest concern was to find like this stable source of funding so that they can continue to focus on making films and not worry about running around and trying to raise money for every project. And if you list your firm in the stock market, that provides you with a lot of capital that you can use to invest in filmmaking. And so in the mid-2000s, suddenly there was a lot of kind of enthusiasm about Hallyu, especially the Korean wave. And among investors in the stock market, there was this sense that the Korean film industry was going to grow bigger and bigger and become more and more successful internationally. And so a lot of these investors wanted to invest in film companies. I guess I won't go into detail, but a lot of the firms, they didn't list directly on the stock exchange, but they did what's called a backdoor listing, which means that they merged with another company that was on the stock exchange. And then they had this kind of deal where they would take control of the company. And, through that, you had examples of like a tent making company, their stock price may have been like 900 won per share. But they merged together with the talent agency that represents Changdong-gun. And, within like 2 weeks, their stock price was 30,000 won a share. And so, this is just they're making huge amounts of money in a very short amount of time. And a lot of producers were kind of seduced by this, I think. Both Shin Jae Myung and Seung Jae did a number of different deals to kind of merge with these larger companies, these listed companies. In the end, it kind of all went very badly. Stock prices eventually began to fall when the Korean wave kind of lost some of its momentum. The other thing is, the film companies production companies aren't really well suited to the stock market because There might be some year where you produce a hit film and your earnings go way, way up. And then the next year, maybe you don't produce any films, or you produce a film that doesn't do badly and it goes way, way down. And investors don't like these wild swings in earnings. And so, I mean, basically when this happened, a lot of producers ended up either losing their companies or having to basically start over again. And so the other, I mean, perhaps the more relevant thing is there have also been these shifts in power in the film industry which have affected the way producers work. A lot of major directors started setting up their own production companies. And if you're a successful director, in some ways it makes a lot of sense because you start your own company. If you work with a company like Myung Films, you just receive a salary for the film that you make. If you set up your own company, then you receive a portion of the revenues of the film. And so if you make a really big hit film, you can make millions of dollars. At the same time, a lot of major conglomerates started to go directly to the directors and kind of skip over the producers. They started to form these relationships with directors. And this, I think, is really the key thing. I mean, last month at the Busan Film Festival, I spoke with Oh Jung-won, the third producer who I mentioned. And she said that, I mean, really to understand kind of these shifts of power in the film industry, you just have to follow the money. And whereas before, producers were the ones who were kind of, a lot of the money went through them. These days you have bigger and bigger film companies who don't really want to work with producers. They don't want a producer who will argue with them about the decisions, the creative decisions that they want to make. And they find it much easier to kind of connect directly with the director and to finance their films and to essentially cut the director, the producer out. And this has been basically what's been happening. In that way, power has been shifting towards directors rather than producers. And these big companies who are investing in films, I mean, they're the important players right now. It's a very different situation than we had in 2005 or 2000. For the three directors I mentioned, I mean, these days, he ended up resigning from his position at the head of this company that he founded in 2009. And he hasn't made any films since then. Which has been kind of shocking for some people working in the film industry because he was such a fixture. He made so many important films. And I mean, these days he's serving as the director of these Grand Bell Awards, this Daejeongsang. But he's not involved in producing films right now. Shin Jae Myung, I mean, she had merged her company together with Kang Jae-gyu Films. They'd formed a much bigger company. They had very big ambitions for this company. But eventually in 2008, they were forced to sell it. And these days, she's restarting her company. She was able to take the name of Myung Films back. And they just produced this movie, Cyrano, which is doing well at the Korean box office now. But once again, she owns a very small production company, and she's essentially starting over. Oh Jung-won was one of the few producers who didn't kind of merge her company and go onto the stock market. And so she still has control over her company. But it's become much more difficult for her to make, mid or big budget films. In recent years, she's been working on very low budget films by, very important films in some sense, by Hong Sang-soo and other important directors. This fall, will open kind of her first commercial project in 3 or 4 years. But again, she has much less power than she used to. And I mean, the question is whether this loss of power by these major producers, if you can see the results on the screen. I mean, personally, I think that you can. There's a sense that, I mentioned that some people feel that there's a creative crisis in Korean cinema these days. And it's not because you don't find interesting films. I think that each year you can pick out films that are quite outstanding and films that travel to many different film festivals. These days, the independent film sector in Korea, kind of the low-budget film sector, is really expanding, and they're producing a huge number of films, and many of them are quite interesting. The most famous film directors like Park Chan-wook, Bong Joon-ho, Kim Ji-yoon, I mean, they're able to continue making films. As I mentioned, many of them have set up their own production companies, and then they're working together with the big investors. In the case of Bong Joon-ho, his next film is being produced by Park Chan-wook, and so it's a case of directors are also doing some work as producers. And incidentally, these three directors, their next films will all be in English. That's the current plan. They're starting to go international. But the average Korean film, kind of like the middle of the Korean film industry, the middle has kind of fallen out of Korean cinema, I think, in the past few years. And there's also a sense that the average Korean film is less interesting than it used to be. And there may be different reasons behind that, but I mean, personally, I think that this loss of power by producers might be the primary reason for this drop in quality in kind of average, mid-sized Korean films. When you watch many of these films, you don't get the sense that the director was prevented from reaching his or her vision. Many of them are kind of overlong and they lack focus, and they have these unnecessary elements in them. I mean, if you think of the role of a book editor, I mean, often when editors are going through a manuscript and making changes, often they're not requesting additions, they're going through and cutting things out. I think that's one of the important roles of an editor, is to take out everything that's unnecessary in a book. And I think what's happening in Korean cinema these days is that there is no editor. There's no one playing this role because although 5 or 10 years ago there were these powerful figures who were acting, producing films and fulfilling this role, these days they are no longer doing it. And so that's one of my concerns about Korean cinema these days. But yeah, that's it for my lecture. Thank you.